United Center, Chicago, Illinois, May 31, 1998. The building held 20,321 people that Sunday, and every one of them understood the specific weight of what they had come to watch. In the 8 years since Michael Jordan had first led the Chicago Bulls into serious playoff contention, the franchise had reached 2 three-peats, had won 5 championships, had produced the most dominant sustained run in the history of professional basketball, and in 48 minutes, unless the game unfolded in the Bulls' favor, the entire apparatus was going to end on their home floor against an Indiana Pacers team that had spent 3 playoff series losing to Chicago and had arrived in Game 7 of the 1998 Eastern Conference Finals with the specific hunger of a franchise that had been watching from the doorway long enough to understand exactly what the doorway led to. The Chicago Tribune described Jordan, when the final buzzer sounded, as standing alone in the backcourt while his teammates celebrated in the front court during a stoppage in play. He was slumped over, his hands on his knees, taking a deep breath. The reporter wrote that it was a statement about how much energy he had expended and how much of a challenge the Pacers had presented. That posture, the one Jordan assumed after the game was already won and the celebrating was already happening around him, the one he assumed when there was no competitive reason left to maintain the architecture of readiness, said something about what the 48 minutes had required that the final score of 88-83 and the box line of 28 points, 9 rebounds, and 8 assists did not fully document. The Indiana Pacers had won 58 games in the 1997-1998 regular season. This was a franchise record. The previous record had been set by the 1994-1995 team, which had gone 52-30 and lost in the Eastern Conference Finals to the Orlando Magic on a Smits buzzer beater in Game 4 that tied the series before Indiana's eventual elimination. The 1998 Pacers had constructed their 58 wins in a league that knew exactly how they were going to play. Mark Jackson operating with his back to the basket as the primary initiator, the threat of Reggie Miller's shooting-pulling defenses wide enough to create the passing lanes Jackson needed, Rick Smits operating as the post anchor and primary scoring option in the half-court, the defensive system that Dick Harter had built, finishing 5th in the league in points allowed. Larry Bird was in his first year as head coach. He had set a goal in training camp, players remembered: get home court advantage. He always felt Game 7 on the road would be tough. They had not achieved home court advantage. The Bulls had finished 62-20, matching Utah for the best record in the league, and the United Center was the house where this series was going to end regardless of who was winning when it reached the 7th game. Which was why, when the Pacers took the floor on May 31st, the fact that they had arrived at this place at all, that they had forced a franchise that had never lost a playoff series in 6 championship seasons to reach an elimination game on their own floor, was itself a statement about the distance between what the Pacers were and what the dominant basketball narrative of the decade had been willing to assign them. Rick Smits was 7 feet and 4 inches tall. He had been born in Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, in 1966, had arrived in the United States in 1984 on a scholarship to Marist College in Poughkeepsie, a program that had no prior history of producing NBA players, and had spent 4 years there developing a jump shot and a post-game sophisticated enough to make him the 2nd overall pick in the 1988 draft. The college program at Marist had received him as a 7-foot teenager with no training, and had spent 4 years manufacturing a player whose shooting mechanics, post footwork, and feel for where to receive the ball in traffic were refined enough for professional basketball. He had spent the decade since playing exclusively for Indiana. He did not seek attention. He did not court the media narratives that defined players in the Reggie Miller mold. He sought the ball in the right position and the leverage that his 7 feet 4 inches provided in a post-up game that the Pacers had built their offensive identity around. He had been named to the Eastern Conference All-Star team in 1998, the first All-Star selection of his career after 10 years in the league. A recognition that arrived at the precise moment that Bird's system had extracted the most functional version of what Smits could do. His nickname was the Dunking Dutchman. He averaged 16.7 points and 6.9 rebounds that season, shooting 50.7% from the field. Shaquille O'Neal, who did not distribute respect casually, had named Smits as one of 4 players he feared as a matchup problem. In the post, at his size, with his touch and his shooting range, He was not a matchup problem the Bulls had a clean answer to. Luke Longley was their center. Rodman was listed as a forward. Neither of them had a reliable answer to what Smits could do with the ball 12 feet from the basket at 7 feet 4 inches of leverage. Reggie Miller was 32 years old and in his 11th season. He had grown up in California as the younger sibling of Cheryl Miller, one of the greatest women's basketball players of her generation, in a household where athletic excellence was the ambient condition rather than the aspiration. Reggie had been told by some evaluators entering the league that his body was too slight, that his shooting stroke was unorthodox, that his foot speed was insufficient to guard the league's best perimeter scorers. He had spent 11 seasons converting each of those reservations into a scoring record that was, by 1998, accumulating toward the Indiana Pacers' all-time leading scorer position he would eventually hold. He had entered the league in 1987 and spent his career constructing a persona built on two things: the ability to shoot from positions and distances that other players needed to be more comfortable to access, and the competitive willingness to talk, at volume, about what he was about to do and had just done, in a manner that either motivated or destabilized opponents depending on the opponent's capacity to process incoming information without it changing their physiological state. Against Jordan's Bulls, Miller had become a recurring figure in the most high-pressure moments of the playoff decade. The 1994 series against the Knicks that gave him national recognition, the repeated conference final losses to Chicago in 1994 and 1995 during Jordan's baseball hiatus, the 4-game series loss in 1996 and 1997 before this year. He had made the go-ahead three over Jordan's outstretched hand with 0.7 seconds left in Game 4 of this very series, a shot that had tied the series at 2, and that Jordan had attempted to answer with a three-pointer of his own that rimmed out. Miller and Jordan had been conducting this bilateral accounting across more playoff series than either franchise could calculate without running the records. He was, Antonio Davis said, their Michael Jordan, the player they looked at when they needed to believe the deficit was manageable. Mark Jackson was the floor operator, the guard who ran the offense from the block with his back to the basket, in a style that the Bulls had countered by assigning Scottie Pippen to shadow him full court. A defensive assignment that limited Jackson to 14 turnovers across the first 2 games, and that he described years later as the most suffocating defensive pressure he had ever experienced. The Pacers' defense was 5th in the league. Their coaching staff, under Dick Harter's coordination, had prepared game plans that accounted for every adjustment the Bulls could make. Their leadership, through the 48 hours between Games 6 and 7, had been projecting a specific kind of calm. Miller and Jackson telling teammates to prepare the same way they always prepared, that the work was already done. Bird had walked to the center of the locker room before tip-off and told his team to forget the X's and O's. He said, "Let's go out there and kick some ass." The players jumped up. Antonio Davis would say later that he had been scared. He jumped up anyway. Bird had not been big on speeches throughout the season. He operated on the principle that the preparation was the speech, that what happened in practice and in film sessions was the communication, and that by the time a Game 7 arrived, the words were unnecessary because the work was already done and what remained was execution. He made an exception. His players received it as the specific version of Larry Bird, communicating that he believed in them on the most important night of their franchise's history, which was the only version of that communication they needed. In the Bulls' locker room, Phil Jackson had told his players the day before to not fear losing. He had gotten 2 sentences into the speech before Jordan interrupted him. The interruption was, by multiple accounts, simply this: "We are not losing." Jordan said it in the flat declarative way he said things that he had decided were true. Judd Buechler and Steve Kerr had driven to the arena in silence for 15 minutes. Kerr had broken the silence by reminding Buechler that 2 championships already existed and that losing a Game 7 could not erase them. Buechler protested. He said, "It can't end like this." Kerr said later, "I told him there was no way Michael's last game is a loss in the conference finals. There was only one way this could end." The thought of losing, Tony Kukoc said, never entered the locker room. It was more quiet than usual. Everyone was in his own head, rolling over what might happen in the game. The Indiana Pacers had jumped up when Bird finished speaking. The Chicago Bulls had put their hands in the middle and gone home. The Pacers hit their first 8 shots. They went to a 20-7 lead in the first quarter, playing through Smits and Dale Davis, the power forward who was 230 pounds of physical insistence and whose quickness advantage over Kukoc was the clearest structural mismatch in the series. Against Tony Kukoc, the stretch four whose defensive limitations were a known variable in Indiana's game plan and whose offensive production had been, in the series up to this point, the primary variable keeping Chicago competitive in moments when Jordan was not carrying the offense alone. Jordan opened 1 for 5. Phil Jackson called timeout with 7:45 left in the first quarter. Indiana up 14-5. The cameras in the building were flashing when Jordan was at the foul line. Fans documenting what could have been his last game, preserving it in the specific way that people preserve moments they are not certain they will experience again. Doug Collins, calling the broadcast for NBC alongside Bob Costas, said he could feel the tension in the building. The fans thought the Pacers could win. Costas remembered, "You could feel it. There is a specific kind of silence that comes into a crowd that is watching something develop in a direction it had not prepared for." The United Center did not go silent. It went to a different register, the noise of anxiety rather than the noise of anticipation, the sound of 20,000 people recalibrating their relationship to what was happening. Indiana extended to 20-7. Smits and Dale Davis continued operating through Kukoc in the post. Mark Jackson, despite the full-court pressure Pippen was applying, found enough space to initiate. Jackson had told the team before tip-off they were going to win the game. They were 12 points ahead in the first quarter of a building that had never seen Jordan's franchise lose in the postseason. The Pacers recognized the moment. The Pacers had been in this building before and lost. They understood that the lead had to be protected against a team whose entire competitive identity was constructed around the proposition that deficits were temporary and the process for eliminating them was a known quantity managed by a person in a Bulls uniform. The Bulls recovered in the second quarter. Pippen, Kerr, a Rodman at center lineup smothered Indiana's scoreless stretch. Miller rested the first 4 minutes and 38 seconds of the quarter on Bird's instruction, preserving his legs for the stretch run. Indiana scored no field goals in his absence. The Bulls ran with the possession advantages those misses created and began erasing the deficit in the way they always erased deficits, not in a single scoring run, but in the systematic application of defensive pressure that turned Indiana's possessions into empty trips and converted those empty trips into transition opportunities before the Pacers' defense could set. Jordan came back and hit a putback, then flicked in a hook for the lead at 31-30. Kerr hit 2 semi-transition threes. Miller went almost 7 minutes without a basket. Chicago pushed to 46-39. Miller made 2 consecutive threes at the end of the half to pull Indiana back to 46-45. The specific individual run that the Pacers had described as their version of emergency reserves. The thing that every team that played Indiana knew was possible and had no guarantee of preventing. Jordan sprinted up the floor after Miller's second three and found Burrell for a buzzer layup, 48-45 at halftime. Costa said that layup sticks in his head. It sent the Bulls into the locker room on a little uptick. In the Indiana locker room, Mark Jackson told his teammates they were going to win the game. He had been telling them this since training camp. He believed it. The third quarter was Kukoc's. He hit 5 consecutive jumpers, including 3 threes, opening the Bulls' largest lead of the night at 69-61 with 2 minutes and 17 seconds left. Pippen was dismantling Jackson's entry passes. Smits could not get position. The Indiana foul shooters were missing. Dale Davis, a 46.5% free throw shooter that season, went 2 for 6 from the line in the third quarter alone. The Bulls had built the lead they needed. And then the Pacers came back. A best layup. 2 Dale Davis free throws. The quarter closed 69-65. Jordan would open the fourth on the bench. The Pacers took the opportunity. Jalen Rose went on a personal 4-0 run that tied the score at 69. Indiana's lead came on a Smits and 1, the 7-footer drawing contact in the post, converting the layup and adding the free throw while the United Center absorbed what it had just seen. 72-69 Indiana. The team that had driven 12 hours from Indianapolis for the privilege of playing a Game 7 in a building that had never seen Jordan's team lose in the postseason had just taken the lead in the fourth quarter of that building's most critical game in 8 years. Jordan came back and missed 3 straight shots, 6 consecutive misses. This is the number that the game's critical sequence produced. 6 consecutive missed field goal attempts by the best player in the history of professional basketball in the fourth quarter of the 7th game of a conference finals. And the number exists not as an indictment, but as a document. He had been shooting 36% in a game that required him to be present for 48 minutes, regardless of what the field goal percentage was doing. The 6 consecutive misses happened inside the most pressurized environment his franchise had ever produced in its championship years, against a defense that had been specifically prepared for him across a 7-game series, against a team that had answers to his questions and had demonstrated those answers across 4 wins in the series. He missed. Luke Longley scooted around Smits, tipped a rebound toward Jordan, who caught it and laid it in with 7 minutes and 46 seconds remaining. The Bulls' first points in approximately 6.5 minutes, cutting the lead to 72-71. Best said, "You can't give that team second chances. Every offensive rebound the Bulls collected was a second chance. They would finish with 22 of them. Indiana would finish with 4. The margin in second-chance points was 24-3. The Pacers knew the Bulls were coming back. The psychology of it, the specific anticipation that every opposing team brought to playing Jordan, the preparation for the comeback that existed as a known variable in the opposing team's mental model, was itself a factor that Bill Cartwright, the Bulls' assistant, described specifically. Indiana should have felt, why should they come back? But that's not how sports is. The anticipation of the comeback was part of what made the comeback possible. The Pacers had been trained, by 3 series against this team, to expect it. Smits answered with another and one. The 7'4" center in the post again, drawing the foul again, converting both the bucket and the free throw with the calm of a player who had been making this particular play for 10 seasons, and knew exactly what it cost the opposing team when it happened. 75-71 Indiana, with just under 7 minutes left in the game. Steve Kerr pulled Indiana's lead back to 3 with a 3-pointer, 77-74. The United Center found its voice again, not the anxious version from the first quarter, but the specific sound of a crowd that has been holding its breath for 20 minutes and is being given incremental evidence that the thing it came prepared for is still available. Antonio Davis answered with a bucket of his own from the paint. 79-77, Indiana, with just under 6 minutes remaining. The Pacers had the lead again. They had Smits in the post with no clean answer from Chicago's front court. They had Reggie Miller, who had spent the series delivering in exactly these moments, 22 points in Game 7, and the specific historical record of making Chicago pay for leaving him space. The record that went back to the first time these teams met in the playoffs and that the United Center crowd had been forced to watch accumulate across 4 series over 3 years. They had Bird on the bench. They had the specific knowledge that they had outplayed the Bulls in the third quarter and had taken the lead in the fourth, and that the game, with 6 minutes remaining, was theirs to win or lose on their own decisions rather than someone else's. Jordan was down by 1 in a Game 7 on his home floor with 6 minutes left. He had made 9 of 25 shots. He had been on the bench for stretches and had watched his team's lead disappear in reverse without him. The crowd was doing what crowds do in these moments, providing noise as the only available contribution, the only variable in their control, as if volume were a form of defense. Scottie Pippen's back was hurting. Ron Harper's back was hurting. Rodman was being managed. The dynasty was playing the last important game it would ever play. And the scoreboard said Indiana by 2, and Jordan was driving to the basket. Derek McKee, Indiana's defensive forward who had been assigned Jordan duties throughout the series and who had been playing through a quadriceps strain that would require off-season surgery, fouled Jordan going to the basket. 2 shots. The foul that mattered. Jordan made both free throws. 79-79. The United Center did not go quiet. It went louder. What followed was the 9-4 run that closed the game. Pippen found a seam in Indiana's help defense for a hook layup with less than 2 minutes remaining. 87-83 Bulls. Miller had not attempted a shot until a corner 3 with 2 minutes and 15 seconds left, and Rodman had blocked it. He did not take another. Jordan, whose most important play in the final sequence was not a basket, but a rebound, The 22nd offensive board of the night, a play in which he trucked Smits underneath the basket and leapt between two Pacers defenders to secure the ball and kill 24 seconds of clock. Understood that what the game needed from him in its final minutes was not scoring, but the specific physical insistence that competing for every loose ball and every rebound required. He finished with 22 offensive rebounds as a team, 4-4 against Indiana, a margin that the Pacers said ripped their hearts out. The final score was 88-83. Indiana had not scored in the game's final 90 seconds. The series had been, Scottie Pippen said afterward, the best he had ever witnessed from two teams that had no business being as evenly matched as they were. Steve Kerr, who had driven Judd Buechler to the arena in silence and then assured his friend that no matter what happened, 2 championships were already secure, said afterward, "That was the scariest game we ever faced." Larry Bird, whose instructions before tip-off had been to forget the X's and O's and kick some ass, found that his team had done everything he had asked them to do for 46 of 48 minutes. The Pacers had taken the lead in the fourth quarter of a Game 7 in the United Center. They had outscored Chicago by 7 in the final 12 minutes before the Bulls made the run that closed the game. The players in the Indiana locker room wept. Mark Jackson walked stall to stall, telling them how far they had come. Phil Jackson, who had told his team the day before Game 7 that the important thing was not to fear losing, and had been interrupted by Jordan saying they were not losing, said afterward it was a great effort from Indiana. He said it was not a great game. He said it was hard played. He was admittedly relieved. The Bulls were going to the NBA Finals for the 3rd consecutive year. Jordan was alone in the backcourt while the celebration happened around him. His hands were on his knees. He was breathing. The Chicago Tribune reporter who described the scene wrote that it was a statement about how much energy he had expended and how much of a challenge the Pacers had presented. And the statement was accurate, but it was also something more specific than a statement about effort. It was the posture of a person who had been asked to do something very difficult for 48 minutes and had done it, and who had not yet found the energy to transition from the doing to the celebrating, because the doing had required everything. He had shot 36%. He had made 9 of 25 field goal attempts. He had been at the foul line with the game at 79-77 and Indiana in the lead, and his franchise's entire era on the line, and he had made both shots. The season had been named The Last Dance in training camp, and the name had turned out to be accurate in a way that the team, 8 months earlier, had not fully processed, that The Last Dance was not just a season, but a specific kind of accountability, the kind where every game is potentially the last, and every lead is potentially the last, and every deficit is potentially the last, and the competitor has to decide, in the middle of a 7-game series where the other team has answers to every question, whether the energy required is available and worth deploying. The answer Jordan had provided, in the backcourt with his hands on his knees, was that it was always available and always worth it. The cost of always was the posture he was in when the buzzer sounded. He had made 9 of 25 shots. He had shot 36% from the field in the most important game of the dynasty's final season. He had nearly registered a triple-double. He had taken a game that was 83-79 Indiana with 6 minutes left in a Game 7 and converted it into a trip to the finals. The Indiana Pacers returned to Indianapolis and spent the summer understanding something about the difference between what they had built and what Jordan had built, which was not a difference in effort or preparation or defensive sophistication or the coaching intelligence of a Hall of Fame player in his first year on the bench. They had those things. They had more wins than any team in Indiana Pacers history. They had forced the most successful postseason franchise of the decade into an elimination game on their own floor and led in the fourth quarter and still lost. What the Pacers had understood that morning in the locker room, that Jordan was the trump card, that no one else had it, as Judd Buechler said flatly in the tunnel before tip-off, they understood more specifically by the time the final buzzer sounded. Jordan at 79-79, making both free throws, was not an accident or a hot streak. It was Jordan at 79-79. He had been in this position before, in various configurations, across 15 seasons, and the people who had been in it with him from the other side knew, whether they could articulate it or not, that the man at the line with everything on the line was operating from a completely different relationship to the moment than everyone else in the building. They had built answers to every question. He was the one question they did not have an answer to. Bird would eventually get his team to the finals in 2000, 2 years after this game, with many of the same players. They would lose to the Los Angeles Lakers in 6 games. Smits would retire that summer, his feet finally requiring the acknowledgement that the nerve damage from tight shoes as a teenager had been accumulating across 12 seasons, and that the body had given what the body could give. Reggie Miller would play until 2005. Jordan would retire again in January of 1999 and return again in 2001 for 2 seasons with Washington. The dynasty had already ended, but it had ended at the Bulls' hands, not Indiana's. Phil Jackson was right that it was not a great game. It was a hard-played game, a game that required things from both teams that great games do not always require. The specific stamina of maintaining competitive pressure through a first-quarter 13-point deficit and a fourth-quarter 3-point deficit and a roster that was playing hurt and tired in the last meaningful moments it would ever play together. What it produced in the accounting of Jordan's career is a performance that the box score makes available for misreading. 28 points on 9 for 25 shooting looks like an off night. It was an off night. It was also the night that no one else was capable of having. The man who was down by 1 in a Game 7 with 6 minutes left had been shooting 36% all night and stepped to the foul line and made both shots because making both shots was what the situation required, and his relationship to what situations required was the most precise instrument his competitive career had developed. He missed 16 of 25 field goal attempts. He made both free throws when it was 79-77, and Derek McKee had committed the foul that mattered. That is the thing about the competitors who define their era. They do not need to be at their best in order to produce the outcome the moment demands. They need only be themselves, and trust that themselves, even diminished, even struggling, even 35 years old in the last season they will ever play together, is still the thing that no one else in the building can answer.